The phrase was practical, he told himself. It preserved the city's fragile social order. It prevented hysteria. And most of all, though he would never say this aloud, it honored the craftsmanship of Violet's plan. There would be no investigation that could piece together the path she had taken. The substances she used were natural, their combination untraceable, their timing flawless. The plantation was seized within weeks. Creditors descended like scavengers, dissecting the estate and scattering lives into ledgers. The enslaved were sold off, their families split without ceremony. Old Moses and Thomas were purchased for their skill and endurance. Lily vanished into the commerce that fed the sugar fields of Louisiana. Samuel survived long enough to be sold to Mississippi. He died 2 years later, and those who held his memory said he welcomed death the way a man welcomes release. Violet disappeared, not arrested, not tried, not named. She simply slipped away, as though the earth itself had reclaimed her. Some said she was sold quietly to a remote parish where she faded into obscurity. Some whispered she reached the north. Others believed, in the way stories breathe through generations, that she walked into the French Quarter that night and never stopped walking, finding a way to live by feeding the hungry instead of the powerful. Dr. Tibaido's private journal, discovered more than a century later, revealed what official documents concealed. His handwriting trembled as he attempted to reconcile admiration with dread. She was not born a killer, he wrote. Circumstance bent her into one. If guilt must be assigned, let it fall upon all of us who participated in or benefited from the order that shaped her. After the family's burial, the mansion stood empty for nearly a decade. New owners attempted to settle, but none lasted long. Servants refused to work there. Visitors fell ill during meals. Sounds carried through the halls long after they should have died out. Some swore that in the earliest hours, a young woman in a head wrap could be seen standing near the stove, her silhouette still as a memory, yet impossible to ignore. The building's final years were a slow surrender. A historical society attempted restoration, but accidents plagued their work. Tools went missing. Workers became sick. A man fell from the second-floor balcony claiming a shadow had pushed him. Eventually, they abandoned the effort. When the mansion was torn down in 1894, the kitchen was found in eerily good condition, as though the years had spared it out of dread or respect. A park stands there now. Children play on the grass, unaware of the soil beneath them. But locals say illnesses come quickly in that place, especially during community gatherings, especially near dusk. The smell of something cooking occasionally drifts across the green when no stoves burn, and sometimes, just before dawn, a figure moves between the trees, disappearing before anyone can approach. Whether or not Violet's story remains anchored to that ground, its weight lingers. It speaks of systems powerful enough to shape cruelty into destiny. It warns that those denied humanity may one day become its reckoning. And it reminds us that the line between justice and vengeance is thin, easily crossed, and often crossed in silence. What remains, at last, is a question. Was Violet's act justice, or was it tragedy? Was she reclaiming something stolen, or delivering something no one, not even her captors, could truly deserve? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between the two, a truth shaped by grief, sharpened by hunger, and carried out by a woman who had been given no other path. And so the Bogard family passed into history, their deaths written as fever, their ghosts remembered as whispers. But Violet, whether she survived or became a shadow, lives on in the story itself, in the echo of a supper served with perfect timing, and in the lingering dread of what a human being becomes when cruelty gives her no other shape to wear. If this tale unsettles you, share your thoughts. Stories like this one remind us that the darkest horrors are born not from the supernatural, but from the world we build and the people we break. As the evening unfolded, Violet remained in the wings, watching a litany of human habits. Hands reaching, glasses raised, the way the mayor favored cordials after dessert. She observed with a quiet grief that was near to triumph. She had taken everything from them. She had taken everything until there was nothing left but this one act of retribution, portioned out course by course, timed like a clock until the night would reach its appointed hour. The first unmistakable change moved through the dining room, like a draft no one wanted to acknowledge. It was slight at first, no more than the soft disruption of breath. August, who had been recounting a triumph in business with theatrical pride, faltered mid-sentence. His hand rose toward his throat, puzzled, as if the air had thickened. Celeste let her silk fan slip from her fingers. Her complexion, pale from years of careful grooming, turned the color of wet ash. Dr. Tibito rose quietly. Years of practice had taught him to respond before panic took shape. But even as he moved, he felt something twist in his own gut. A tight, turning knot he could not logically attribute to overeating. The physician's eyes scanned the room. He saw young Philippe's face trembling with an unnatural flush, saw Blanchard's labored breaths, saw Gromar Borar blinking too slowly, swallowing too hard. What followed entered the room with a terrible swiftness. Pain bloomed across bodies with the precision of a conductor easing his orchestra into a darker movement. Chairs scraped, wine glasses tipped and shattered. Lucille clutched her abdomen, the twins doubled over with small, strangled cries. The mayor, red-faced and sweating, gripped the edge of the table as if bracing against a storm only he could see. Gromar Borar collapsed first. Her fall struck the floor loudly enough to silence the room for a heartbeat. Then the screams broke open, raw, animal sounds that seemed impossible inside a dining room filled moments earlier with velvet laughter. Little Amali, her ruffled white organdy dress clinging damply to her skin, cried for her mother. Her small voice thinned as the poison surged through her quicker than through the adults. Dr. Tibito knelt beside August, but his hands shook violently. Someone must. Send for help, he gasped to old Moses, who stood in the doorway stunned, his face stricken. The doctor tried to stand, but nearly folded in half with his own wave of vertigo. It dawned on him, with cold, clinical certainty, that whatever had been served this night worked in unison, as if designed to dismantle every system of the human body at once. No antidote existed for such intention. The dining room, once a stage for elegance, transformed into a chamber of ruin. Bodies convulsed. Crystal glittered in puddles of bile. Conversations collapsed into moans and frantic prayers. Mayor Shuto crawled toward the door, leaving behind him a trail of desperate attempts to purge what was already too deep inside. And in the kitchen, separated only by a door, Violet stood with her hands resting on the long wooden table where she had prepared her life's most elaborate performance. The screams reached her like echoes from another world, distant, inevitable. Tears fell down her cheeks, not in sobs, but in the quiet, steady way rain falls from a sky that has held too much. When Samuel entered, moving carefully, breath uneven, the kitchen felt suspended, as though the very air had paused between heartbeats. He saw her face, saw the wet tracks on her skin, and understood that the moment he had feared had now passed beyond the realm of undoing. "Violet," he whispered, "what have you done?" She turned, slowly, gently, as though waking from a long trance. Her expression was neither triumphant nor broken. It was drained, resolved, something emptied of everything but truth. "I served them what they served us," she said. "Exactly. Nothing more." By midnight, the mansion lay in silence, broken only by the faint rustle of servants praying softly in corners, and the scratch of Dr. Tebito's pen as he forced his trembling hand to complete the necessary legal forms. The doctor's survival puzzled even him. Perhaps he had eaten less than the others. Perhaps years of medicinal exposure had altered his body's responses. Whatever the reason, he remained alive enough to write. And he wrote a lie. Sudden fever of unknown origin. Preparation for the feast became a ritual. Violet moved through the kitchen with silent control, delegating where necessary, but insisting on handling the pivotal elements herself. She baked and browned and basted. She fermented and stewed. She timed breads and sauces like a conductor setting dynamics. The menu she chose for that Sunday was both homage and instrument. Turtle soup to open the appetite and begin the slow work. Pompano with its fat and oil to carry oils into the bloodstream. Squab with a rice stuffing to ground and delay. Meat courses to layer effect. And the finale, her mother's bread pudding with pralines and custard to seal the orchestra. Each course would carry a small, precise contribution to the overall outcome. No single plate would show guilt if inspected alone. There were practical choices that made her scheme cleaner. Octave, proud and public, had insisted that for the harvest celebration all house slaves remain within the mansion that night. No one would be allowed to leave lest any hint of scandal leak. That decision made the setting perfect. Every witness, every participant in her humiliation would be present under crystal and flame. It was, in Violet's mind, an immaculate stage. Mama Bridget wrapped the final herbs in paper and added a last, almost ceremonial warning. "Once you set this tide, there is no shore to run to," she said, folding her hands into a shape that could have been prayer. Violet accepted the packet as someone accepting a plow. She did not speak of regret. That night, the two women shared a look that carried any number of words the law would never write. The household buzzed with anticipation in the days before the supper. Guests were invited with the kind of polite eagerness that signaled prestige. A judge, a banker, merchants, the mayor, the family physician who kept one foot in polite society and one foot in the shadier corners where conscience insisted he tread. Dr. Tebito arrived with his satchel, unaware that his tools would be useless against a design built of herbs and timing. The mansion prepared like a theater before opening night. Flowers in every room, candles trimmed, crystal polished until it seemed to glow from within. Violet's movements grew almost surgical. She arranged ingredients not only by taste but by chemistry. Where fats would carry elements farther, where acidity would speed absorption. She concealed small doses in sauces and fillings, distributed them among dishes so that no single serving bore the entire weight. Her calculations were the work of someone who had learned to measure by instinct. A teaspoon here, a powder the size of a pinhead there. Old Moses noticed that she had become eerily precise, that she listened for footsteps as if counting beats, that she seemed to have the household's location mapped inside her head. When Sunday morning dawned cool and clear, Violet rose earlier than usual. The day itself felt conspicuously ordinary, as if the world had conspired to keep its face neutral while the house prepared for violence. She dressed, she worked, she checked and rechecked. Samuel watched from the periphery, his face drawn. He wanted to stop her. Instead, he obeyed her words the way a man obeys the tide. He did not come to the table. By late afternoon, guests arrived in a pattern of carriage wheels and small, perfect bows. Laughter filled the receiving rooms. Political brags escaped lips, and Octave smiled with a self-satisfaction that made him nearly luminous. Violet hovered at the edges, unseen. At 6, old Moses announced the procession. The family and its guests moved like a trained ceremony toward the dining room, where linens waited and silver caught the light. Violet watched them seat themselves, matched each plate to the body that would take it, and let the service begin. The first courses were received with the applause Violet had learned to expect. Turtle soup, aromatic, rich, warmed their palates. Pompano followed, delicate and complex. Compliments came trooping like well-bred guests, loud and sincere. All the while, the slow machinery Violet had set in motion advanced. Small aches went unnoticed. A momentary pallor was put down to heat. Dr. Thibodeau, who observed with a physician's eye, noticed faint signs. A slight constriction here, a thirst that did not match the amount of wine being drunk. But he misread them as indigestion. None of them knew the meal plotted against them was already working through its quiet arithmetic. Mama Brigitte sat under a canvas stall in the market's deepest corner. An old woman whose hands were like dried roots and whose eyes had seen more revolutions than any ledger could list. She had been born free in Haiti before that island's upheaval, and some said the wind itself taught her what herbs could do. Violet began with small questions, casual as a sneeze, about stomach bitters and the best way to dry rue. Mama Brigitte answered with stories, and stories contained the calculations Violet needed. Which roots aggravated the stomach into convulsions, which barks thinned the blood, which fungi could make the heart stumble as if surprised. Their conversations were a kind of apprenticeship in darkness. Mama Brigitte spoke not in the clinical tones of a physician, but in the slow arithmetic of survival. This root here, she told Violet, holding a knotted piece of bark. It sings gentle at first, makes a belly fold and groan. Use too much, it sings louder. Use with the wrong companion, and it will choke a throat shut. She wrapped the precious pieces in brown paper, as if wrapping a small sin, and pressed the package into Violet's hands with the same gravity she might press a blessing. Violet listened and catalogued. She learned timing, how long until an herb began to bloom in the body, and dosage, how a teaspoon could be a comfort and a tablespoon a reckoning. She learned that some compounds acted slowly, building like a tide, while others hit like a stone. Most valuable of all, she learned how combinations behaved, how one ingredient might blunt the symptom of another, masking the origin until even a practiced physician would puzzle. In a world that had denied her the most trivial morsel of power, knowledge became the only currency she could trade. Back at the mansion, she began to test stealthily, like a woman tasting the edges of a new recipe. A pinch here, a whisper of a root there. August complained of a slight ache, and Violet noted the way he reached for his pocket watch afterward. Philippe flushed and tried to laugh it off. Celeste shifted her hand toward brandy she suddenly needed to steady her nerves. The household, warm and flushed with summer and pride, mistook these little ailments for heat, for fatigue, for the small indignities of life in New Orleans. They were wrong. At night, when the house sank into the low sound of servants' footsteps and the garden hummed with insects, Violet kept another kind of vigil. She catalogued where each person sat, what they preferred, how much their plates usually held. Gromar Borar took her medicine 30 minutes before meals. Octave liked his meat rare. The mayor had a fondness for cordials after dessert. She watched the children's manners like a cartographer of human weakness. What they ate first, what they always left for later. Each small observation folded into a larger geometry. She learned not only what they ate, but how their bodies responded. And that knowledge allowed her to compose timing the way she had once composed sauces, layers of effect that would only reveal themselves when the courses had finished. The work consumed her, and it isolated her. Even old Moses, whose life had etched him into a patient understanding of people, felt the change and peered at her with something like worry. Samuel watched with a grief that grew every day. Where she had once laughed over spills and shared the small rebellions of their existence, she now moved with the cool intent of someone who has reduced mercy to an instrument. In the garden, under an indifferent moon, he tried to reason with her. "Violet," he whispered one night, "this path, you could still turn away." He was afraid, not only for himself, but for the woman he loved. He begged the way a man begs a storm to pass. She looked at him with an expression that kept both distance and decision. "I have already been broken," she said softly. The words had no heat in them. They were a ledger closed. "I can make them remember," he pleaded. If she loved him, he said, there must be another way. For a moment, a stole glance, something like the old violet flickered. The woman he had known, the hands that soothed, and the laugh that was quick as bright sugar. Then it vanished, replaced by a patience that sent his skin cold. "If you love me," she said, "you will not be here tomorrow night." He realized, with a kind of slow terror, what she meant. He tried to leave, to hide, to buy a ticket in his mind for a life away. He did not. Old Moses, the butler, had served the family for decades. He moved through the house with the practiced invisibility of someone who has learned when to hold his voice and when to make his presence known. His loyalty was public, his eyes private. There were other names. Lily, a maid with beauty the men of the house admired too loudly. Thomas, the steady hand in the stables. Thomas's son Samuel, whose wounds would later open the wound that spread through the household. The rhythms of the mansion were old and precise. Breakfast at 7, lunch at 1, and the crown jewel, Sunday supper at 6. The table for that evening could seat 20, and every place was a marker of rank. Violet began preparing Sunday suppers on Friday. She scoured the French market for the best produce, planned 7 formal courses that would show the family's Creole heritage and her own subtle genius. A light soup, fish, fowl with exotic spice, multiple vegetable dishes, elaborate meats, and the finale, desserts that were less food than small miracles. The ritual of the supper was part theater, part religion. At 5:30, the family assembled for cocktails in the parlor, the men with brandy, the women with cordials. At precisely 6, old Moses intoned that supper was served, and the household moved like a procession. Octave sat at the head, Celeste at the opposite end. Seating was a map of power. Beneath the ritual lay the pressure. The family was in debt. Poor weather had damaged the sugar crop the year before. Creditors circled like vultures. Octave's temper frayed. He spoke in short words. His eyes went cold over the ledgers. He threatened to sell human beings to raise capital. The household learned to read the signs. It was into this atmosphere, during a sweltering Thursday in late June, that a moment occurred that would set the ledger of fate into motion. Violet was arranging canapes when she heard Samuel's voice cut through the courtyard, fractured, pleading. She ran to the window. Samuel knelt in the dust, his shirt torn, blood glistening on his back. Octave stood over him with a leather whip, mouth spitting accusations. "You dare look at my daughter with those eyes?" Octave roared. "You forget your place, boy?" Violet could not watch a man she loved be broken. She burst from the kitchen and threw herself between the whip and his back. "Please, Master Octave," she cried. "Samuel done nothing wrong." There was an instant, a thin, real pause, in which Violet believed mercy might arrive. Octave's face shifted, from rage to a low, cold calculation. To him, her act was not only insolence, it was a claim. "The cook thinks she can tell me how to discipline my property," he whispered, close enough that she smelled death in the brandy on his breath. He ordered Samuel locked in the tack room, given no food or water. For Violet, he devised a punishment sharper than any lash. She would continue to prepare food for the family, but she would not eat until every member declared themselves satisfied. Octave smiled at the cruelty of it, at the power of making her watch them eat what she could not touch. The next 3 days unspooled as a slow torment. Violet worked with hands that trembled from hunger. Octave found fault in every dish and reveled in the spectacle of her suffering. Samuel escaped briefly on the second day, only to be caught and punished until even Dr. Tibito feared for his life. The doctor observed Violet then and wrote of a look he'd seen before, the look of someone pushed too far. In his notes, he would later divide people into those who break and those who harden. Violet's eyes, when he saw her tending Samuel's wounds, were not the hollowed, defeated eyes he expected. They burned with a dangerous focus. On the third day, something inside her changed. As Octave theatrically praised her bread pudding while she swayed on starvation, a fog cleared and a cold clarity settled. She began to watch differently, not as a cook, but as a solver of equations. She noticed habits, how Gromar Borar took medicine 30 minutes before meals, how August checked his watch every 15 minutes, how little Amali ate the vegetables first. She cataloged tremors and tonics, appetites and vulnerabilities. This was not the whim of a desperate moment. It was a plan forming with the same deliberate care she had always given a complicated sauce. She would feed them. She would feed them what they deserved. Violet's next moves were as quiet as a seasoning added just so. Precise, deliberate, almost invisible until the taste revealed itself. She began to visit markets not for fruit or fish, but for knowledge. The French market, a place of color and smell, held shadows as well as vendors. There, among folded linen and jars of pickled things, she found women who kept old names for old remedies, a language that didn't belong in polite apothecaries, and so survived in the spaces between commerce and superstition. In the humid summer of 1847, 13 members of the Bogard family died within hours of one another in their Garden District mansion. The parish registers buried in the Louisiana State Archives record the cause as sudden fever, the neat, official line that comforts bureaucracies and buries scandal. But the margins of private papers, a hurried inked sentence here, a trembling pencil note there, tell a different, darker story. Dr. Armand Thibodeau, the physician called in that night, confessed in his journal that he had never seen agony move in such a synchronized, methodical way. He wrote that the symptoms did not match any disease he knew. Fingernails blackening, tongues swollen to a violent purple, screams that echoed in the halls until dawn. The timing was the cruelest detail. Every death came exactly 90 minutes after the family's Sunday supper. And in the room where the food had been prepared, only one person remained alive: Violet, the head cook. For a century and 70 years, the Bogard tragedy sat behind a wall of shame and silence. Old money and new grief prefer tidy explanations, and so the phrase "sudden fever" became a lid sealed over something rancid. Yet the true story, the slow, patient stones that led to that single night of obliteration, began long before a single spoonful was ladled or a single candle was lit. It was rooted in a cycle of cruelty so steady, the city itself learned to breathe around it. New Orleans, in 1847, was a city of brilliant contrasts. Mansions rose like testaments to fortune, their white columns scraping the sky. Beneath them, the economy was a dark machine powered by the labor of the enslaved. In the Garden District, Spanish moss draped ironwork like funeral shrouds, and the owners who dined beneath crystal chandeliers owed their comforts to hands that never saw daylight. The Bogard Mansion, a 3-story Greek revival edifice with Corinthian columns and a garden that pretended to be serenity, belonged to Octave Beauregard. He had inherited the house and the family's sugar plantation, and he inherited, with equal weight, a reputation that split along 2 languages. In polite company, he was a strict disciplinarian. In the quarters, he was something much worse. Octave ruled with a temper that bent men and women into the shape of obedience. His wife, Celeste, a Creole of breeding and brittle manners, learned early to look away. Her position in society was a currency she chose not to forfeit. Their children, Etienne 19, Margot 17, Philippe 15, and little Amalie 8, were raised to regard the people who worked in their home as objects to be managed, the same way fragile porcelain and silver were managed in the dining room. The house also sheltered extended kin. Auguste, Octave's younger brother, with his wife Lucille and twin sons Henri and Louis. Octave's mother, Gromar Borard, frail but still wielding social authority, and Tante Félicité, Celeste's sharp-tongued sister whose eyes missed nothing. 26 enslaved people kept the household in motion. They bore the invisible scars of a system made to wound. Among them, Violet was both singular and invisible. Born in the slave quarters in 1823 to Essie, the previous head cook, Violet assumed her mother's role when Essie died exhausted and young. By 14, she ran the kitchen. By 24, she had garnered a reputation that reached the polite tables of New Orleans. A hand that knew spice and heat as if the world had been measured on the backs of her fingers. She could coax sauces into moods, draw sweetness from stubborn ingredients, and make the house guests speak the language of awe. Her talent, though, came at a price. Violet worked 18 hours a day. Her room was a windowless cell with a straw mattress, 1 change of clothes, and a small wooden cross that had belonged to her mother. Her position brought privileges. She was rarely whipped. She was spared the cane fields. Sometimes a discarded dress found its way to her. But she could not taste the food she was forced to prepare. Octave took a perverse pleasure in this cruelty, reminding her, aloud, that while she produced feasts fit for kings, she would live on scraps. The other enslaved people looked at her with a mixture of reverence and pity. She moved among them as both a leader and a loner. The demands of her station carved away the small intimacies that softened life in the quarters. Samuel, the stablemaster's son, was one person who pierced that isolation. He was 28, and between the courtyard's horses and the kitchen's heat, he and Violet had stolen glances that hardened into something like love, the sort of fragile, dangerous interior life the plantation could not abide. He dreamed of buying freedom, of slipping north to territories where laws, if not kindness, might be on their side. But dreams cost money on a plantation where a robust field hand was worth $50 a year. The ledger left no margin for hope.